Mexico is building a trade war, and Trump is the reason. While the world watches the incoming president prepare his tariff arsenal, Mexico is making moves that could completely upend Trump's anti-China strategy. President Claudia Sheinbaum just announced plans to impose tariffs of up to 50% on Chinese cars and over 1,400 other products. But here's the twist. This isn't the victory Trump thinks it is. It's Mexico playing a much deeper game that could leave Trump's trade war in shambles. To understand the full scope of what's happening, we need to look at how Trump's pressure tactics are creating ripple effects across the global economy.
Post on Truth Social, Donald Trump addressed all the NATO countries and the world and said that he has said that Washington was prepared to move forward with major sanctions on Russia, but only if European partners halted the purchase of Russian oil and joined in a coordinated action. Remember, he has always been speaking about the fact that Russian oil only has been, kind of sponsoring and funding war against Ukraine. Akanksha is now joining us on the phone line. Akanksha, each day, Donald Trump makes it very clear, you buy Russian oil, you're going to have to pay the price.
Absolutely, and this is now doubling down as far as the pressure on Russia is concerned. Because remember, Pallavi, he's been urging all of G7 nations particularly to put a stop to any kind of purchase of Russian oil. And Donald Trump clearly in this Truth Social post is losing patience. He's already made it clear that he will do major sanctions on Russia, but only when all NATO countries are on board.
The president has been issuing ultimatums left and right, demanding that allies join his crusade against both China and Russia. He's threatened massive sanctions on Russian oil, but with a catch. European partners must first halt their own purchases of Russian energy. This all-or-nothing approach reveals Trump's belief that economic coercion can reshape global alliances overnight. But Trump's strategy goes even further, using trade policy as a weapon in ways that could backfire spectacularly.
Trump made the request during a meeting with senior U.S. and EU officials in Washington. The proposal is aimed at pushing President Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table with Ukraine. We're joined now by Bloomberg's digital politics editor Romy Verghese in California and MLive strategist Mark Cranfield in Singapore. Romy, let me start with you because we continue to see these tensions over trade and the fact that not every country wants more strict sanctions on Russia, especially in the energy sector. What does this new request mean?
Yes, this is another topsy-turvy day for global trade right now. I must say, the development about Trump making this request, but saying that the EU nations must agree to do so, comes just before he said that he's going to engage in trade negotiations with India, and this really shows how Trump uses trade and deals as a way to keep people on their toes and try to get what he wants. So yes, we do have EU nations such as Hungary that have blocked more stringent approaches on Russia. But of course, the U.S. has already doubled the tariff on India to 50% because of its purchases of Russian crude. So we will see what happens when the U.S. and India continue their negotiations. I mean, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was looking forward to talks with his very...
The administration has proposed conditional tariffs on India and China, contingent on EU nations agreeing to similar measures. This complex web of threats and conditions shows how Trump views trade not as economic policy, but as pure geopolitical leverage. He's essentially trying to force the world into choosing sides, believing that America's economic might will guarantee compliance. The legal foundations of Trump's tariff strategy are already under attack.
Yeah, so you have it exactly right. There's a three-level process in the United States. The first level was the U.S. Court of International Trade. They ruled against the tariffs. Recently, we heard from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. They ruled, but it was a 7-4 vote. It was regarded as a very divided court over here. So I think the administration has now, the Supreme Court has agreed that they're going to take the case. The administration is going to make its argument to the Supreme Court. And I definitely think that there are people in the administration who think they have a good chance of prevailing on that appeal. And obviously that will be the ruling, and that will be the one that decides for all of us whether the president has the power to impose these tariffs or not.
The case that was made before the previous two courts, and the courts didn't quite buy that view, is that this is not an economic emergency and that the president does not have, the powers. If anybody has the powers, it's the United States Congress that has the powers to use these during an economic emergency, which they were not able to convince the courts of. How do you view that?
Well, the Congress passed a statute, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977. That statute says that if there is an economic emergency, then the president can regulate imports. Now, the court below divided over what the power to regulate imports means. Some judges thought it included the power to impose tariffs. Other judges thought it didn't include the power to use tariffs. Still, other judges thought, well, he might be able to impose tariffs, but he can't impose this many tariffs. So those are kind of basically the three positions. And I think the administration is going to argue that if the statute gives him the power to regulate imports, presumably he could block imports, he could stop imports, then he should be able to charge a fee for imports. And we'll see how that argument goes.
Federal courts have struck down presidential powers to impose tariffs under 1970s emergency economic legislation, with the case now pending before the Supreme Court. A divided appeals court voted 7-4 against the administration's interpretation of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, it could unravel his entire tariff-based foreign policy approach before it even gets started. Meanwhile, Mexico has been walking a tightrope between its largest trading partner, the United States, and the world's second-largest economy, China. Mexico has become the top export market for Chinese vehicles. China supplies nearly 1/5 of cars sold in Mexico, with brands like BYD and Chery flooding the market with affordable options that Mexican consumers love. This surge in Chinese imports hasn't gone unnoticed in Washington. Trump and his allies have been watching with growing alarm as Mexico becomes what they see as a backdoor for Chinese goods into the North American market. The draft bill comes as the U.S. is placing significant pressure on President Claudia Sheinbaum to crack down on Chinese industry in Mexico. Washington is concerned that Mexico could be used as a backdoor for goods from China to circumvent steep duties, particularly given Mexico's preferential access to the U.S. market through the USMCA free trade agreement. The timing of Mexico's announcement is no coincidence. The USMCA, a free trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, is set for review next year. This review could make or break Mexico's economic future, and Sheinbaum knows it. But here's where Trump's strategy starts to unravel. Mexico plans to impose tariffs of as much as 50% on cars and other products made by China and several Asian exporters, aligning the country more closely with U.S. protectionism as President Claudia Sheinbaum prepares for talks over North America's free trade deal. On the surface, this looks like exactly what Trump wanted, Mexico cracking down on Chinese imports to appease Washington. But look deeper and a different picture emerges. Gabriela Siller, director of economic analysis at Banco Base, said on X that demand for Chinese cars in Mexico will increase in the short term due to the announcement of the 50% tariff, which will increase their price. She also noted that the tariffs on imports from countries with which Mexico doesn't have a trade agreement have two objectives. 1, greater tax collection, and 2, to get on well with Trump. This reveals the calculated nature of Mexico's move. It's not about genuinely reducing Chinese influence, but about managing Trump while maximizing Mexico's own benefits. The scope of Mexico's proposed tariffs is massive. The bill seeks to place higher tariffs on more than 1,400 categories of products, coming from countries with which Mexico has no trade agreement, thereby impacting $52 billion of imports. Other nations set to be impacted by the bill include South Korea, India, Indonesia, Russia, Thailand, and Turkey. But here's the key detail that shows Mexico's true strategy. Cars made in Japan and Europe, which have free trade agreements with Mexico, would not be subject to the 50% tariff. Cars made in the United States and Canada can enter Mexico tariff-free thanks to the USMCA Free Trade Pact. This selective targeting reveals Mexico's sophisticated approach. By exempting countries with existing trade agreements while hitting China and others, Mexico is sending a clear message. We reward our partners and punish those who don't play by our rules. The Mexican government is framing this as industrial protection. Ebrard said that the main objective of Sheinbaum's tariff plan is to protect already established jobs. He also said it is aimed at protecting Mexico's strategic industries. The Mexican automotive industry is 23% of national manufacturing, so we have to protect it. One of the ways to protect it is to increase the tariffs that these light vehicles pay, Ebrard said. The Economy Ministry said in a document that the measures would safeguard 325,000 at-risk industrial and manufacturing jobs. But Mexico's motivations go far beyond job protection. Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard said Tuesday that the imposition of tariffs on Chinese products is a measure to try to reduce Mexico's trade deficit with China, which exceeded US $57 billion in the first 6 months of 2025. Mexico's trade deficit with China will reach US $119 billion in 2024, the largest in history, and in the first half of 2025 alone, it totaled more than US $57 billion, he wrote. This massive trade imbalance has become a serious economic concern for Mexico, independent of any pressure from Washington. The political calculation behind Mexico's move becomes clearer when you consider the upcoming USMCA review. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the backbone of North America's competitiveness, will undergo a formal review starting in July 2026. What was once expected to be a routine assessment aimed at improving implementation is now likely to become a high-stakes negotiation. U.S. President Donald Trump has made tariffs a cornerstone of his reshoring and manufacturing agenda, targeting not only geopolitical rivals but also long-standing trade partners like Mexico and Canada. These tariffs, often imposed for both trade-related and non-trade-related reasons, have already triggered bilateral negotiations. Their ripple effects are likely to shape the 2026 review. For Mexico, the stakes couldn't be higher. Canada and Mexico rely on the U.S. economy far more than the United States relies on either of them, although the relationship is important for all three. Mexico and Canada sold 80% and 76%, respectively, of their exports to the United States in 2023. Comparatively, 32% of U.S. exports in 2023 went to Canada and Mexico combined. This asymmetry means that the asymmetry here engenders a higher level of political importance for the USMCA within Mexico and Canada. Employment in Mexico is especially dependent on trade with the United States. When negotiations begin in 2025, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum will be under an entirely different level of pressure from her citizens to maintain favorable trade relations with the United States and Canada. But here's where Mexico's strategy gets really interesting and where Trump's approach starts to backfire. By implementing these tariffs now, Mexico is trying to get ahead of Trump's demands while maintaining maximum flexibility for the 2026 negotiations. Mexican President Sheinbaum will be eager to preserve the deal by appeasing the U.S., although tariffs on Chinese goods could push up prices for consumers. However, the tariffs also serve Mexico's own economic interests by boosting government revenue and protecting domestic industries. What Trump may not have anticipated is how Mexico's move could actually strengthen China's long-term position in North America. First, analysts note that the higher tariffs would likely raise car prices in Mexico, reduce consumer options, and limit competition in the domestic market. This could create consumer backlash against the Sheinbaum government, potentially weakening Mexico's position in future negotiations with both the United States and China. Second, China isn't sitting idle. The Commerce Ministry in Beijing urged Mexico to think twice before acting, stressing that the two nations are mutually important trade partners. The Foreign Ministry added, "We will resolutely safeguard our own rights and interests in accordance with the actual situation." China's Commerce Ministry issued a statement urging Mexico to exercise extreme caution and consider carefully before taking any actions. These aren't idle threats. China has shown it's willing to retaliate against countries that impose trade barriers. More importantly, China has options that could circumvent Mexico's tariffs entirely. The addition of countries other than China addresses the issue of China using other Asian nations to send cheap Chinese imports via transshipments from those countries to escape tariffs. While Mexico's tariffs target multiple Asian countries to prevent this kind of circumvention, China's vast manufacturing network and trade relationships give it numerous ways to adapt. The real genius of China's position is that it doesn't need to fight Mexico's tariffs directly. Instead, it can focus on what Trump fears most, using Mexico as a staging ground for North American market access. Chinese companies could increase their direct investment in Mexican manufacturing, producing goods locally that would qualify for USMCA benefits and tariff-free access to the United States. This is exactly the scenario that keeps Trump's trade team awake at night. Trump and other stakeholders in the U.S. have been particularly concerned with China using Mexico as a backdoor to access the U.S. market under USMCA terms. This could lead to stricter enforcement of trade provisions and monitoring of Chinese investments in Mexico. If Trump returns to office, it's expected he will push for even more stringent measures to curb Chinese economic activities within Mexico. But Mexico's current tariff move actually provides cover for increased Chinese investment, as it demonstrates Mexico's willingness to impose trade barriers on China when necessary. The timing of Mexico's announcement also reveals the sophistication of Sheinbaum's strategy. The president pushed back on the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry's accusation that the announced tariffs were taken under coercion to constrain China or undermine China's legitimate rights and interests. Sheinbaum stressed that the proposed tariffs neither target China nor are the result of U.S. pressure. "We have a very good relationship with China, and we want to continue having a very good relationship with them," she said, insisting the measure has to do with the strengthening of our economy and Plan Mexico. This messaging is crucial because it allows Mexico to maintain diplomatic relations with China while appearing to comply with U.S. pressure. At her Friday morning press conference, while still insisting that the duties are not coercion measures, she said officials in her administration have already made plans to speak with China next week about the new tariffs. This suggests that Mexico and China are already working on ways to manage the impact of the tariffs, potentially through increased direct investment or other arrangements. The economic reality behind Mexico's move also undermines Trump's broader trade strategy. Another aim of the tariff plan is to attract new investment to Mexico, just like Trump is seeking to lure foreign companies to the U.S. with his protectionist agenda. Due to existing international policies, it is necessary to implement concrete actions that enable a balanced market interaction in order to avoid economic distortions that could affect the relocation of the productive sectors considered strategic for the country, the bill says. This reveals that Mexico is essentially copying Trump's playbook, using tariffs to attract investment and protect domestic industries. But Mexico has a significant advantage. It offers lower labor costs, proximity to the United States, and USMCA benefits. Companies looking to serve the North American market may find Mexico more attractive than the United States, even with the new tariffs on Chinese goods. The implementation details of Mexico's tariffs also show how this could backfire on Trump. The reform bill proposes as the implementation of duties at rates of 10%, 20%, 25%, 30%, 35%, and 50%. The tariffs would initially be imposed until December 31, 2026, but their application could be extended. The fact that these tariffs have an expiration date tied to the USMCA review shows that Mexico is using them as a negotiating tool rather than a permanent policy shift. The reform bill will almost certainly be approved as the ruling Morena Party and its allies dominate both houses of Congress. At an event at the Felipe Angeles International Airport in Mexico State on Wednesday, Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard said that Mexico would increase the tariff on Chinese cars to the maximum level permitted by the World Trade Organization, which is 50%. This means Mexico has room to adjust these tariffs up or down depending on how negotiations with both the United States and China develop. But there's another dimension to this story that's been largely overlooked. Recent developments show Russia, China, and India appearing together at major summits, sending shockwaves through Washington's corridors of power.
It really has, and it has in fact fed into the kind of rhetoric that they have been trying to amp up, that it is India, China, which are in fact funding the war in Ukraine. And when the trio turned up in Tianjin, that in fact was a message to Donald Trump that they will not be bowing down to these sanctions or additional tariffs, because that is the which were represented at SCO, even though that's a security meeting. But several Eurasian economies, even the global south, the week that's gone by has also witnessed a virtual summit that was in fact held by Brazil as far as the BRICS summit was concerned. So we've seen that there's been a rallying of these global south economies, and they are good enough to sort of tackle the West, and the West is very much aware that they cannot do without business as far as these developing economies are concerned. EU is very mindful of that, and EU President Ursula von der Leyen, in fact, is very mindful of that. In her constant and consistent engagement with the Indian Prime Minister, she's always maintained that much can be achieved out of the FTA that is being forged between EU and India. And she, in fact, has appealed to Prime Minister Modi that he must use his good offices to, in fact, mediate the conflict in Ukraine. So Donald Trump, at the moment, all of his attack is also coming out from a space of frustration. Not only is he running out of time, but he's also being questioned in terms of the label that he's always given himself, that of being this messiah for peace, a man who deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. All of that has now been put to question, given that he's not achieved anything with the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The SCO summit demonstrated how these three powers are coordinating their response to Western pressure. They're sending a clear message that they won't bow to sanctions or additional tariffs. The BRICS virtual summit held by Brazil further rallied global South economies, demonstrating their collective strength to tackle Western pressure. The broader implications of Mexico's strategy extend far beyond trade policy. The upcoming review will be a defining test for North American cohesion and hence global competitiveness. Its outcome will determine whether the region can modernize its trade framework to meet today's economic and security challenges, or lose 30 years of economic integration at a time of increased global uncertainty, economic fragmentation, and heightened geopolitical confrontation. By positioning itself as a responsible partner that's willing to impose trade barriers on China while maintaining diplomatic relations, Mexico is setting itself up as the reasonable middle ground in what could become an increasingly fractious trilateral relationship. The USMCA remains the foundation of North America's economic strength and a key counterweight to China's global influence. Mexico's strategy acknowledges this reality while maximizing its own leverage. The potential for this strategy to backfire on Trump becomes even clearer when you consider the consumer impact. The measure is likely to influence investments in dealership networks associated with Chinese brands, which collectively invest over $3 billion and create more than 32,000 direct jobs. If Mexican consumers face significantly higher prices for vehicles and other goods, the political backlash could weaken Sheinbaum's government and make Mexico less reliable as a partner in Trump's anti-China strategy. Moreover, the tariffs could accelerate trends that Trump is trying to reverse. Higher prices for Chinese goods in Mexico could drive more Mexican companies to source products directly from China or to invest in Chinese manufacturing facilities. This could actually increase China's influence in Mexico's economy, just through different channels. The global context also works against Trump's strategy. China will remind countries aligned with the United States that if this is how Washington now treats Canada, China is a better friend to have. This raises the question of how long the United States can sustain a trade war against its neighbors. Mexico's tariffs on Chinese goods might provide temporary cover, but they also demonstrate how Trump's approach is forcing even close allies to make difficult choices that could ultimately benefit China. Perhaps most importantly, Mexico's move reveals the fundamental weakness in Trump's trade war strategy. It assumes that tariffs and pressure will force countries to align completely with U.S. interests. But Mexico's response shows that countries will adapt and find WWAs to serve their own interests while appearing to comply with U.S. demands. Failure to extend the term in 2026 will create significant uncertainty for businesses, leading to reduced investments across all three countries that will be economically costly and delay the investments needed to develop these industries and compete with China. Indeed, this is what happened during President Trump's first term when the business uncertainty caused by the renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA depressed investment in the US, Canada, and Mexico. The ultimate irony is that Trump's pressure on Mexico to impose tariffs on Chinese goods might actually strengthen China's position in North America. By forcing Mexico to choose sides, Trump is pushing China to be more creative and aggressive in its approach to the region. Chinese companies may respond by increasing direct investment in Mexico, forming joint ventures with Mexican companies, or finding other ways to access the North American market that don't rely on direct exports. As we approach the 2026 USMCA review, Mexico's tariff strategy positions it as a player that both the United States and China need to take seriously. The country has shown it can impose trade barriers when necessary, but it's also demonstrated that it won't be pushed around by either superpower. This balancing act could give Mexico significant leverage in the upcoming negotiations, potentially allowing it to extract concessions from both Washington and Beijing. Trump's trade war was supposed to force countries to choose between the United States and China. Instead, Mexico's response shows how sophisticated middle powers can play both sides while advancing their own interests. The 50% tariffs on Chinese goods might look like a victory for Trump's strategy, but they're actually evidence of how that strategy is creating new complexities and opportunities that could ultimately benefit China. In the high-stakes game of 21st century trade policy, Mexico just showed that it's playing chess while Trump is playing checkers.